A proverb goes, food first, ethical niceties second. Yet in our world today, 1 in 10 people globally and as many as 1 in 5 in Africa face hunger. A report by the International Fund for Agricultural Development and 4 other UN bodies revealed that last year, an estimated 30% of the global population, or 2.3 billion people, were moderately or severely food insecure. As we celebrate the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty on October the 17th, we must ask, how secure or insecure is the world in terms of food? What kind of innovative efforts should be taken to leverage greater finance for food security? Given rising geopolitical tensions, what actions are necessary to continue the fight against hunger and poverty? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, coming to you from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined by Alvaro Lario, President of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD, and Chair of UN Water. Mr. Lario, welcome to The Point. So, in a nutshell, where are we in terms of food security? How secure or insecure are we on this planet?
Well, unfortunately, the latest figures show that we are not in the right trajectory. Since COVID, there's more than 100 million people that have fallen back into poverty and hunger. We are talking about 1 person out of every 10 in the planet, so around 750 million people, and those figures are very alarming. Unfortunately, after COVID, a lot of the global disruptions on value chains and local production have had a massive toll, and this is very worrisome. If you also think about healthy diets, more than 1 person in 3 in the world cannot afford a healthy diet. So you can see there the inequality of people not being even able to buy healthy food, and that also happens with small-scale farmers, even though they are the ones producing the food.
I see. So 1 in 10 is facing hunger, and 1 in 3 is not eating healthy.
Cannot afford
to
Yes.
eat healthy. On a technical note, how do you define security or insecurity? What is your definition of hunger here?
Well, here we're talking about the ability of being able to have the minimum nutrients and the minimum food intake in a day. And that happens, unfortunately, all over the world, but especially in Africa. You can also go into even more deeper technical discussions when we talk about stunting, which is many times stunting is among children when they are under 5 years old, that they cannot have this minimum nutrients, and that affects them for the rest of their lives. And that's also figures that are extremely alarming. We're talking about hundreds of millions.
But you're talking about the wrong trajectory. Basically, things are getting worse. Is COVID the main reason now that COVID is over? Are we going to see a bettering of the situation? Are the right things being done?
Well, it's the wrong trajectory because after 3 or 4 decades of impressive numbers of people in the world getting much lower in terms of hunger and poverty, the data have been very positive, and China has been one of the leading countries in the world, really making a huge advance in terms of hunger and poverty. And I want to also congratulate the Chinese people for having eradicated absolute poverty. Now the figures for the last 3-4 years have gone in the other direction. One part of it is COVID. You have also the invasion of Ukraine as another of the big issues on global supply disruptions. And generally, unfortunately, there have been a lot of food price increases, food price shocks. So there's a lot of disruptions that have affected how people are able to produce and also consume food.
So the situation seems to be pretty bad. What are you focusing on to bring the trajectory back in the right track, and why are you here in China?
Well, for us, the mandate very much aligns with what China has been doing under example, which is eradicating poverty and also revitalizing and investing in rural areas. We invest in the first mile where food is being produced. So actually we're supporting small-scale farmers on access to land, access to water, access to technology, access to financing, credit, insurance, ownership of land, very much focused on rural women and rural youth. And actually in China, we do have still projects, especially in the western provinces. And for us, the strategic partnership with China is incredibly important. We have been investing in China for 40 years. We started in the early 1980s, and the country has had a tremendous transformation. However, there's a lot of lessons learned in that transformation. So we are lucky to have this strong partnership with China.
Well, there's a lot of information in what you just said. For instance, we know that China has got rid of absolute poverty, but we're not talking about poverty in general. There are still pockets of very poor population, especially in the rural areas. So what are your focus now that we have gotten rid of absolute poverty? Where are you going, especially through a financial perspective? What are you talking to, and with which interlocutors, if I can use this word?
Yes, so if we talk about global investments beyond China, our focus is mostly on low-income countries, low-middle-income countries, and countries affected by fragility. As you said, that's not the case, fortunately, anymore for China. However, there's still inequality and areas where we can support China in rural revitalization. Most of it is in, as you mentioned, in certain pockets. And that's where I believe that the strategy of rural revitalization by the government is very important. And we are seeing how we can mobilize both private money as well as other areas of blended finance and mechanisms that can actually support specifically that first mile and rural areas that still need investments.
Can you give an example when you talk about the first mile in the rural area and in terms of financial support? What are you doing? What are you proposing? For instance, what you need China to couple their efforts with?
Well, in the case of the programs everywhere in the world, I mean, the important part for us is how we can actually mobilize financing and invest with financial institutions, with governments, with climate funds, in order to have programs that actually support farmers in increasing their productivity, in access to markets, because many times we focus only on the production, but they need to be able to sell their products in a market and at a fair price. We're talking about storage, we're talking about rural transportation, otherwise you cannot really be able to sell your products. You're talking about certification, you're talking about mechanization, agriculture productivity, using the right seeds, having access to water. In many places in the world, unfortunately, irrigation systems are not reaching to that first mile. So it's basically making farming a business, enabling them to have an income generating opportunity so that they can drive their own development.
And what do you think can be done, or what kind of cooperation are you proposing with the Chinese government to help the first mile, to help the smallholders especially?
Clearly, China has a very clear vision of how they can support the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, the Global Development Initiative is an accelerator of the Sustainable Development Goals and can serve very much to support many of these areas. I mean, we are very aligned in terms of poverty reduction, sustainable development, digital connectivity, being able many times to have these investments that might seem not very big, but they catalyze a lot of that rural development, which is where poverty is located. Throughout the world, 80% of poverty is in rural areas. And China has had a lot of experience throughout these decades on how to eradicate it. So we very much count on China as a leader in terms of sustainable development, but also on sharing some of those lessons learned. I have seen pictures of IFAD's program 40 years ago, and they look very, very different to now. I visited last year some of our programs in central China, and actually what started as small aquaculture projects there now have become into tourism, like rural tourism. Others, right now, I was also in a tea farming cooperative, and actually now they're selling through TikTok. So there's a lot of evolution from 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think that ability of selling the products, of accessing the markets, of investing in rural areas, we can also try to bring those lessons learned to other parts of the world.
How interesting. You actually alluded to the kind of evolution of the collaboration IFAD has had with China over the past 40 years. In the beginning is more or less IFAD bringing better practices into China, and now you're talking about China sharing its experiences with the rest. How was this possible? I mean, when you look at that, what does that tell you as an international philanthropist, head of international organization trying to help the very grassroots people?
Well, I think the main, I would say, hope is that it can be done. Actually, if you start investing in agriculture productivity in rural areas, that can transform many of the rural communities and also help in poverty alleviation. We know that agriculture investments and agriculture productivity investments can be 2 to 3 times more effective in creating rural jobs and increasing incomes than in any other sector. So China clearly went through a big transformation of its economy, but agriculture productivity, food security was at the core and at the center of this eradication of poverty. So I think there's putting agriculture investments, rural investments, making sure that you don't leave anyone behind, I think can provide a real direction for many of the other countries.
What other experiences China can share with other countries besides prioritizing rural development?
Well, nowadays it's very clear the development stage and development journey is very different than 30, 40 years ago. So one of the issues right now, as I was mentioning, is obviously technology and the application of technology and science. Now, it's very clear that there's a lot of, I would say, solutions that also Chinese research centers and universities are putting forward that can be also translated. Indeed, we have been very lucky also. President Xi recently announced a 10 million investment of a South-South triangular facility with IFAD. And that's one way of really sharing a lot of that knowledge with other countries, mainstreaming it into an operations and making sure that lessons learned on technology and what can work can also be brought to other countries.
What is the role of IFAD in this process? How do you see you serving as a catalyst, to spreading the good practices? While at the same time, I believe China still has a lot to learn from the better practices around the world.
Indeed, I think IFAD is, for us, our mandate is rural transformation. We are the only institution in the world that only focuses on rural areas. Currently, food security, climate adaptation have become some of the big global challenges. So I think for us, is our main, I would say, challenge is how can we scale up the amount of investments and the effectiveness of the investments that are going into those rural areas. Being a financial institution, we have put forward a number of solutions. The first one is we were the first United Nations agency or program who got a credit rating. So now we are mobilizing money from pension funds, from investors into these rural areas. We are also using our own money to co-invest with the private sector, to catalyze investments from the private sector. So I think we have to all adapt to the needs of the countries nowadays and to the realities on the ground. Private sector is clearly one of the potential solutions because official development assistance and investments in development are not enough. We are talking about hundreds of billions. And public sector cannot afford to pay that. So we need to make ways of leveraging private investments into these areas too.
What has been the responses you have been receiving in terms of this is innovative finance, I guess, for development. What are the private investors saying? What are the governments are saying about this approach?
Well, I think there's a lot of hunger and appetite, actually, more than we can even are able to issue in terms of bonds, because the reality is that on the ground we are showing the impact. We measure the income raised by the farmers. We also raise how many millions of farmers we have made access to the markets and being able to sell their products, how many millions of farmers we have increased their production. So there's a lot of appetite. If you think about all the sustainable development goals, we are really tackling sustainable development goal 1 and 2 on hunger and poverty, but also many of the others related to climate change, related to gender equality, transforming many times the lives of rural women. So there's a lot of appetite. We need to make sure that how do we make that happen in the countries? How can we provide more affordable loans or grants to these countries in order to invest more in the rural economies?
How is China's response so far? Can you tell us a bit more about China's response? I know you have been having extensive meetings and China is determined to revitalize its rural areas, and China is also determined to share the benefits of its development with the global South countries. So what has been China's response, and how is this collaboration going to proceed? and turn the vision into reality.
So there's a big political response, a big commitment of China, both to continue partnering in China in terms of rural revitalization, but even more importantly, on investing in the rest of the countries, in the rest of the world, on low-income countries, and making sure that both with their own funding, but also catalyzing other funding, we can transform these rural areas. So the commitment is at the highest political level. As I mentioned, some of the leaders here in China. So we are very happy with the response, and we believe that we are seeing that China wants to be a committed leader in terms of multilateralism and on making sure that we are investing on the countries who need it most, which in many cases nowadays is the low-income countries and least developed countries.
What are the biggest challenges, though, that you foresee moving forward? It seems that, well, goodwill is not enough. Innovative ideas is not enough. The realities are very different, very diverse, and very daunting. You mentioned the geopolitical conflicts in the beginning of the conversation. So what are the challenges you're foreseeing and the preparations you are coming up with to overcome these challenges?
So I think at the global stage, I see two big challenges. I mean, one is clearly global inequality among countries, but also within countries. We're just seeing that that's rising even more over the last years. The second one is very clearly climate change. When I talk to many of the heads of state, even in Africa, it's very clear that they are going through floods, droughts, extreme heat. Some of them have not had rain for 5 years. So you cannot have a viable business or even a viable farming business if there's no water, access to water. So I would say both global inequality, which in many cases creates pressure within the countries in terms of forced migration, but also in terms of climate change. I think those as two very big ones. And I think that's why it's important that we all come together and try to find common solutions. If each country tries to do it on a bilateral way, we will not find really an effective tool to these common challenges, because these challenges are common, are global. They don't relate to an individual country.
So how do you plan to do it instead of a bilateral way, or China, IFAD, US, IFAD, Germany? How do you plan to do that? You mentioned this triangular cooperation facility. Tell us a bit more about that. How is that vision potentially able to overcome some of the challenges?
So IFAD is a universal institution. We work in almost 100 countries, even though most of our focus is low income, least developed countries, which are the ones who need more of our funding. So we have a very strong governance where all of the countries you mentioned come together and decide together. We are not seen as a very political institution, but a very effective, results-oriented and impactful organization. And as a president, that's the way that I want to see it. What we need is to have results for the hundreds of millions of rural people that actually are going through that suffering. In our case, during the last 3 years, for example, we increased the income of 77 million small-scale farmers. I think that's a huge impact on the world, because many of them are in these really challenging rural areas, in countries that do not have a very strong ecosystem. So that's why it's even more important. The same goes with climate adaptation. It's great to think about mitigation, but the hundreds of millions of people that are in these rural areas need to adapt right now to the challenges they're going through. So that's why I think finding some of the common lessons learned is important in our relationship in China, but even more important is the strong leadership to really change the conditions in many of these countries.
You mean the leadership in the countries, in the individual countries, or the leadership of...
Well, in our cases, in the institution, I mean, in the governance of being able to come together, to come to compromises and to focus on the outcomes and focus on the results of transforming the realities on the ground. And that in my institution is happening. That's, I think, one of the positive sides that I see, that people are coming together, because who wouldn't want to overcome rural poverty? Who wouldn't want to give more tools to the small-scale farmers? And that's the outcomes that we need to find right now. There's no time. We're talking 1 in 10 right now in the world, and they need the solutions right now. They cannot wait 3-5 years.
Yeah. Well, I think these are, of course, very, very important, extremely urgent, but at the same time, we're seeing economic difficulties. We're seeing a sluggish global economic growth. China just announced its third quarter economic development. The number is not too bad, but still we have a lot of work to do. So in this kind of global economic situation, how can you persuade people that investing in these financial initiatives for the small farmers is a smart decision?
So I would say, what is the alternative? The alternative is to wait some years, and then you will have much more cost in terms of humanitarian assistance, which can be up to 10 times higher once a lot of the challenges go into much more difficult situations. The alternative is to continue producing food in an unsustainable manner and eroding land, eroding water resources. That will pay a price in 5, 10, 15 years. So I think there's no other alternative. If you invest right now in trying to build that resilience for when the shocks come, the cost along the way will be much, much lower. So I don't see any other alternative. And indeed, it's difficult because we're talking about medium-term investments, long-term investments that actually change the realities. But there's no magic bullet to really eradicate hunger. It has taken a number of decades for China with a big economic transformation. So if we want to make it happen in other parts of the world, we need to invest right now.
You mentioned the Global Development Initiative. I would like to hear a little bit more about that, because China is, of course, very dedicated, and China is taking a strategically patient perspective on that. How can that support IFA's work in terms of making the right investment at a long-term trajectory?
I think that's a very good point. I was meeting with the chairman of the China Development Cooperation Agency, and the focus, as you said, is in what type of mechanisms can catalyze money, whether that's through grants, whether that's through concessional loans, in a way that can bring others on board, and in a way that is looking at strategically at the medium term, so that we can also avoid the costs I was talking before. And that's the vision I'm hearing and I'm seeing. We support very much a lot of the areas, as I mentioned, on the Global Development Initiative. They can really catalyze, this type of investments can catalyze and accelerate many of the goals for 2030. And we know that we are off track for the Sustainable Development Goals. So any initiative like the one that China has put forward that can accelerate changes and structural changes, trying to address the root causes of poverty, providing many of these rural people with the tools to really drive their development, not just food aid or humanitarian assistance, but trying to address those root causes are very important.
Well, I'm going to ask you these questions of curiosity, because if you read the press, you will hear a lot of questions raised about China's sincerity, about China's intention in sharing its development with global South with developing countries. How do you look at these issues? And especially when we talk about finance, the question of debt comes up all the time. I don't know whether it's related. I'm not a financial major, but I would just like to hear your responses or your observation when you interact with the Chinese stakeholders. What do you think is their intention, and what do you think, how sincere they are in terms of really sharing their what we have achieved over the past 40 years with the rest of the world?
Well, thank you. I cannot really read into the sincerity or the comments. It's difficult for me to comment. I can see the actions. I mean, the reality, as I mentioned, is that the Chinese Cooperation Development Agency has put forward a number of billions of dollars to try to catalyze some of that money and to be able to promote and drive sustainable development. If we talk about the issue of debt, which I think is a separate issue, it's not China, it's the entire world. I think that we are currently seeing that low-income countries, this is also data, reality, low-income countries, 60% of them are in debt distress. The reality is that many of them are spending more money on debt servicing rather than on health, education, and transportation. Let me put you an example. Right now in Ethiopia, they are spending $26 on debt servicing per capita, vis-a-vis $8 on health per capita. That's also data, but that belongs to the entire world. I think concessional finance and development finance is a very good investment at a very low rate in order to catalyze private sector, but also to catalyze a lot of this sustainable development impact that has a huge impact in societies in terms of social fabric, of social capital, of transforming realities. I'm a big believer in this type of investments. So I see China committed to continue investing in sustainable development, and I think that's good news.
What's next for China, though? Because when I'm talking about China, I really don't just mean China, because I believe you see it as well. What China is trying to achieve will be an experiment for developing countries in general, right? And looking back, we are going to share what we stepped in as a positive experience or a lesson to be avoided. And I'm going to focus on, for instance, what is the biggest lesson that has been learned from the China experience involving IFAD, and going forward, what does China really have to pay attention to so that when other developing countries are following similar paths on their agricultural modernization, they don't have to waste time?
It's a very good point. I think that China's green revolution, so to say, started to me with agricultural productivity, as well as with providing farmers with the tools. This also involves mechanization. So I think both the right seeds, the right access to water, mechanization are very key parts. Then another important lesson learned is that you need also strong institutions, you need a certain rule of law, and you need predictability. And I think China has been very committed to provide all of those. We just recently saw the Nobel Prize announcements in terms of what drives growth and what drives nations to fail or not to fail. And there's two lessons learned from the three professors. And it's that rules of law matter and strong institutions matter. So I think the focus, as we were saying, on agriculture productivity to enhance and to lift people out of poverty is a very important one, but also creating the ecosystem and providing many of these farmers with the tools to do so.
Moving forward, because now that our countryside looks very different than 40 years ago, I'm sure you have visited some of the rural areas. What are you seeing that can be done better? And I'm not asking you to criticize China. I'm asking you, is there any better practice or what new innovation we have to come up with, probably for scenarios that have not been seen ever before in developed countries either?
Well, I see it's difficult, given all the Chinese scientists and experts that are here, to provide them with any recommendation. What I can say,
but what are you saying to yourself? What can happen next?
No, what I see as a big challenge for China, but also for other countries, including in Europe, which are going through similar challenges, is how do you produce food in a sustainable manner with nature, with the ecosystems, with the use and consumption of water, with the use and consumption of the natural resources in a sustainable manner, and in a way that the small-scale farmers do not receive all of the cost and have to pay for that transition, to do it in a way that does not erode the land, overconsume the water. That's a challenge for China, but for the rest of the world at that development stage too.
Is it possible to achieve that? Because we have 7 billion people, and here comes the problem of food insecurity and security. When you have security, probably sometimes comes with a cost, which is compromised quality. I do not know whether it is ever possible to feed the world in a sustainable manner.
I think it is. I'm optimist. I think there's other alternatives to, let's say, just big industrial farms. That's one possibility, but there's also many others where especially small-scale farmers and throughout the world, indigenous peoples, rural women and men can produce it in a way that is also friendly, let's say, to the use of, as I was mentioning, their land and their water. It has been possible. It's a challenge to do it at the scale that we may need it, but we are solving a lot of other technological issues with AI, with many other matters. Why wouldn't we be able to solve that? I think it's a matter of political commitment, and it's a matter of making sure that that's also a priority. So I'm an optimist. In terms of also the relationship of the private sector, and especially here in China, but also in other developing economies and throughout the world, for us, the most important part is not only to talk about the big food conglomerates, but actually about the local private sector. How can we make sure that many of the businesses that are creating the majority of the jobs in all of the societies, like the rural, the small, the medium enterprises related to agri-food, continue to grow and have the means to be a really viable business? And that's where I think IFAD's connection with many of the public sector loans and how to make sure that we support them through public agriculture development banks is a very important addition. And we're looking also forward to do so in China.
Thank you so much for accepting our interview. Alvaro Lario, President of International Fund for Agricultural Development and Chair of UN Water. Wish you good success.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
With that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got the point.